Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this very special interactive digital program from the International Women's Forum. I'm Anne Duncan, Vice President of IWF and Chair of IWF's Communications Committee, and I'm very excited to be hosting this virtual visit of the National Gallery, London, in conversation with Dr. Caroline Campbell, Director of Collections and Research at the National Gallery and a fellow member of IWF UK. Museums and cultural institutions have been accompanying us more than ever during the pandemic. How are they reflecting on their role in the future post-pandemic? We'll be exploring this today in a very personal way, and I'll be introducing Caroline in just a moment. But first, a few housekeeping notes. If you're familiar with the Crowdcast platform, you'll know that the chat function is just for that, for commenting, posting links, exchanging with more than 525 people already participating today. And if you find that box distracting, you can minimize it by clicking the down arrow at the top of the screen. And of course, please do ask your questions by clicking the words "Ask a Question" on the bottom of the screen. And in fact, we want this to be very interactive. So let me go straight to introducing Dr. Caroline Campbell. Since 2018, she's been the Director of Collections and Research at the National Gallery, London, and previously worked as a curator at the Asman Museum, the Courtauld Gallery, and the National Gallery. Her exhibitions and books include Leonardo, Experience, a Masterpiece, Bellini and Montaigne, Art and Dialogue, Making Color, Love and Marriage in Renaissance Florence, Temptation in Eden, and Bellini and the East, among others. She lives with her husband and 2 children in the southeast of London. And all of us have a story about how art came into our lives. Caroline's upbringing in Belfast during the Troubles made her powerfully aware of the power of art to take us out of ourselves and into a better place. Today, she's taking us out of our homes and into a magnificent place, one of the world's great museums. Caroline, are you with us?
I am, Anne. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I can't believe that there are nearly 600 of us all together across the globe. It's really powerful. It's the power of IWF. And it's wonderful to be able to share with you some of the things that we would have been experiencing together in London at the conference that many of us would have been at this month. So I'm going to take you into my great museum. It's about 1.5 miles where I live. I haven't been in there since the 21st of March. I'm hoping actually to go in on Thursday for the first time and check that everything is all right. But what I wanted to do today was to take you to the National Gallery, introduce it or reintroduce it. I know many of you know it. To talk a little bit about what we would have done if we'd been there together, and then to think a bit about what art galleries and museums mean in this time of isolation, and then end with some personal thoughts of mine about what the museum of the future in this post-pandemic world might be. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and thoughts as well as we go on. So I'm showing you the National Gallery as I see it most days when I walk to work. This is one of the wonderful lions designed by Edward Landseer that are just at the bottom of Trafalgar Square, and they guard the square and they provide a marvelous backdrop to the gallery, which stands at the far end of Trafalgar Square, one of the grandest civic spaces in Europe, built in the Victorian period to commemorate Britain's great victories, and at that point what was seen to be her great imperial present and indeed future. London, of course, has changed an awful lot since the 19th century, but what hasn't changed is the National Gallery, which plays a fundamental role not just in the cityscape of London, but in many of the lives of Londoners and the people who visit and flock to this great museum. The National Gallery was founded in 1824, so we're just coming up to celebrating our 200th anniversary in 4 years' time. And the collection is quite small. It's only of about 2,500 paintings, but literally, and this is true, not true of most museums, Every work in the collection pretty much is a masterpiece. And the idea of the gallery, behind the gallery when it was founded, was to tell the story of great art, from Botticelli, from works in the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe, up to the early 20th century. And the gallery was also always intended to have a really strong public mission. It was to connect people and paintings. It was to improve people's lives. And this was very much part of Victorian philanthropy and well-being. It was intended that if you saw beautiful things, it would make your life better. And so the gallery has had a long and proud history of being open to a wide public, in fact, really being open to everyone. Though the idea of what a national gallery is has changed a lot over the last 200 years. That idea of giving access to great art to everybody because it makes people's lives better is really key to its identity. And of course, we go up to the early 20th century, and just to give you a range of the collection in terms of chronology, here's Van Gogh's Sunflowers, a painting that really needs no introduction, painted in the late 1880s for his friend Gauguin, who was coming to visit him disastrously, as it turned out, in the Yellow House in Arles. So the National Gallery over the last few years has attracted about 6 million visitors a year. I'm showing you a scene of the gallery during our incredibly busy usual summers. This is our central hall. This was a period when we experimented with hanging the Impressionist paintings, which are among the most popular in the collection there. And I think you can probably see from the number of people why we decided not to do that again, because it was really a very crowded visitor experience. But visiting the gallery is normally a really crowded experience. We have, of those 6 million visitors, last year about 35% of them were from London, 65% were from outside. The majority of those were international tourists. So it'll be no surprise to you when I say that we're looking at a very different picture in the future. If you had been with me in London this week, you would not just have experienced the gallery itself, but I was going to take you behind the scenes. And the great thing about digital is that I can actually still do that. I can't introduce you to Paul and Amanda, who I'm showing you on the screen, but I can tell you a bit about their work, and I can encourage you to go onto the National Gallery's YouTube or other social media platforms and hear them talk about what they do. So Paul, who's on the left, is one of our really incredibly talented, skilled and experienced conservators. Here you see him in front of the great Van Dyck equestrian portrait of Charles I on horseback. Charles I, like many small people, had a real knack of showing himself in a way that he wasn't. So he seems incredibly grand and grandiose in this fabulous picture. And Paul's been restoring it for the last 2 years. One of the very last things we did before we closed the gallery on the 18th of March was that we laid this picture down on the floor of the studio so that we could frame it. The picture's about 12 feet high, so you can see that was quite a business. Amanda, who you see on the screen on the right, is one of our skilled frame conservators and gilders. And she's working in this picture on a new frame for one of our Venetian Renaissance masterpieces, a painting by Giovanni Bellini, which again was the subject of a really long restoration treatment. And we put on display about 2 years ago. So I'm really sorry not to show you these individuals, these really skilled individuals. The National Gallery is one of probably about 2 or 3 places in the world where these types of crafts are done to an unbelievably high international standard. And we love to see our role as sharing that with everybody, not just with visitors to the gallery, but increasingly and more through our digital platforms so that you can really understand what we do and not just enjoy the paintings. I'd also have taken you to our two exhibitions. I'm showing you a room, a very, very special room, which opened to the public for 3 days in March before we had to close the gallery. This is the recreation of a room painted for Philip II of Spain, probably the most important person in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world, in the middle years of the 1500s. He was King of Spain, he was Emperor of Mexico, and he got the great artist Titian working in Venice to paint a series of mythological works for him, which we brought together for the first time since the 1590s. And yet we had to close the space. They're glorious, wonderful paintings, and I would have loved showing them to you. You can enjoy a film on the BBC iPlayer, if you get access to that, about this beautiful, wonderful space and its relationship to cultural history, which I hope you'll be able to take advantage of. But I'm really sad not to show this with you. We are hoping to be able to keep this exhibition on when we reopen later this year. But I also would have loved to have shown you our exhibition, our landmark spring exhibition, which we've had to postpone till the autumn. That's looking at the woman you see on this big slide on this screen. Her name is Artemisia Gentileschi, and she's one of the greatest painters of the Baroque period. She was a woman who some of you may know, with a very troubled and difficult life. She was raped by the man who hoped would marry her. She had a very difficult life, but she was an extraordinary artist. And this would have been the first exhibition in Britain and one of the first exhibitions anywhere devoted to her. And I'm showing you beside it the two people who really made that happen. Our director, Gabriele Finaldi, and my dear colleague, Letizia Trevis, our senior curator of Italian and Spanish painting. The painting by Artemisia I'm showing you, we purchased 18 months ago. It's been very exciting as a woman leader in a museum to really spearhead the acquisition of art by women, because sadly women didn't have much of a role in the history of art, and we're really trying to redress that at the moment. So these are some of the things you would have seen in London. And here's just a line of the posters we had in the gallery the day before we closed of our upcoming and just opened exhibitions. So now, if you come to the National Gallery, you don't see any of these things because you don't have the opportunity to go in. If you happen to walk past the gallery, as I've done quite a few times in the last 8 weeks on my social distancing walks through London, you see an empty, wonderful shell of a gallery. The pictures are safe within it, but the people, either the visitors or staff who normally animate them, are gone. And yet, for all that, the art inside the National Gallery is working harder than ever. It's doing an amazing role to give people solace and, in many cases, a sense of inspiration and purpose in their lives. Now, I'm not showing you the way the gallery looks at the moment here, but I'm showing you pictures of the gallery on the last occasion that the National Gallery was closed, the only previous time in its history we've had to shut the building, and that was during the Second World War. At that point, the collection was evacuated to a slate mine in North Wales, and there were no pictures in the space, but the galleries were full of activity. Dame Mara Hess, who you might be able to see standing next to the piano on the left-hand image, organised daily, and yes, I do mean daily, concerts in the National Gallery. And the slide on the right shows a picture from one of our wee photo albums in the archive of the queues of people who came to hear these concerts and also to attend the exhibitions of contemporary art that the gallery hosted throughout the war years. It became, at this moment, a very significant place in the life of Britain's culture, which it hadn't really, I think, been before. And something else that the gallery did at this time was it brought back one picture a month from Manod in North Wales to London. This was from February 1942. And I'm showing you here the first picture of the month, again, a work by Titian, an artist who you might have guessed I really love, Noli Me Tangere, Don't Touch Me, as it was installed in February 1942. Now, that's an interesting choice, isn't it? I certainly know that would not be the picture that people would want today, not because they don't love it, but because the sense of touch and physical connection we see in this work is almost, I'd say, too painful for us to deal with at the moment. So it's been a very, very, very strange 8 weeks for somebody like me and my colleagues whose job is to bring art to people, because we've had to think about how we do that in completely different ways. Something that's made it much easier for us is the fact that people, even without us doing anything, have been taking pictures into their own homes. You might have seen, if you visited our social channels, we've been using a strapline, the nation's pictures in the nation's homes. And that's really what's been going on. The images that I'm showing you on the slide here are some of the most famous and most beloved picture in the National Gallery. And they're also the pictures which people have been downloading most over the last 8 weeks. In fact, rather to our surprise, the most popular download has been a picture made in the 1430s in Bruges. That's the painting at the far left hand of my screen, the so-called Arnolfini marriage, painted by Jan van Eyck in Bruges in the 1430s. But all of these works are works which people have been downloading, looking at, and using in all sorts of wonderful and very, very personal ways, from Turner to Vermeer to Holbein to Leonardo and Seurat. And we've also been finding that people use pictures in different ways for different spaces. The picture of the month is a tradition that we've had at the gallery since the 1940s, as I've mentioned. And this month we asked people to choose it. And curiously, the painting they chose wasn't the Van Eyck, which is the one that they seem to be downloading most, but this wonderful Van Gogh. Because I think one of the great things about art at this moment is that it takes you out of yourself. It takes you to a different space. Looking at this, you can imagine yourself in Provence, or else you can even take yourself into the National Gallery itself on a whole number of virtual tours. So I think we've all been working really fast to be able to develop content which people are able to use in whatever way they want, whether it is like this, which was a virtual tour we had of the Sainsbury wing of the earliest part of the collection, one I have to admit that people hardly used when we first put it up in 2015, but has been being activated more and more since March. People have also been using gallery pictures in their virtual lives. This is a detail of one of my favorite escapism pictures in the National Gallery. It's a painting by a Finnish artist called Galen Kallila, painted in the early 20th century. It's a lake called Lake Keiteli in the north of Finland. And we've been giving people the option to download pictures and put them as their Zoom background or their Teams background for their virtual call. I highly recommend this one. And many other people have also found that terribly pleasant too. But I think the fact that you can escape from a picture wherever you are is really compelling. And we've been using that idea to create very quickly content that, again, we're making from our homes. And we hope you're enjoying in yours, from online exhibitions on a number of themes. This is one that we launched today because the 12th of May is International Nurses Day. And this is to celebrate the role of healthcare professionals in the National Gallery collection. Now, you may have to work quite hard to work this out, so I'll give you a few clues. Tobias and the Angel, the figures you see at the far left of my screen. Tobias was a young man in the Apocrypha of the Bible who was said to have gone and got a fish from a stream at the behest of the archangel who's with him, the archangel Raphael. And then he smeared the gall of the fish on his father's eyes and he was cured from blindness. So this was very important symbol in medieval Europe of how people could be cured in all sorts of supernatural, natural and special ways. The little painting on gold beneath it is a German painting again of the Renaissance period, and it shows two saints, Cosmas and Damien, who were the patron saint of doctors and indeed still are today. And then you see somebody being bled, one of those medical events that I'm very glad doesn't happen anymore. And then two doctors, an Italian doctor at the top right, painted by Titian, and a German gynecologist, painted by the German painter Lovers Corinth in Berlin in 1899. He was apparently the greatest gynecologist in Berlin, but he also spent a lot of his time translating Livy's History of Rome from Latin into German. So I do wonder how much time he spent in his medical studies. But things like this are things we're really finding that people are enjoying at the moment and making suggestions to ourselves of selections for pictures too. It's very light touch, but it's pretty good. other things we've been doing, which have been much harder to do as somebody who did film themselves for the first time last week from their kitchen, is making talks that you can enjoy from your homes. This is my very talented colleague Lucy, taking you from her sitting room in Clapham, southwest London, into the countryside via paintings by Rubens, by Corot, and by others. And this was me struggling last week with trying to go from the strangeness of home working in a very busy, confused household with kids doing ballet and music lesson and God knows what all the time, into an imagined beautiful space that painted by the Sicilian artist Antonello de Messina in the late 1500s, 1400s even. And we've been trying other things too, which are much less art historical. This, I think, has been the most interesting for me. This is a screenshot from a meditation, which my colleague Chrissy Bradstreet in our learning team has been developing. She's been running these as physical meditations in the gallery. And we launched our first online one last week using what I would have thought the world's most unmeditative painting, Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed, which shows a train rushing across a viaduct in Maidenhead in Berkshire, but it's really good. It actually works. I do urge you to try it. And this is a type of content which we're going to be developing and putting out more and more in the weeks and months to come, because I think what we're finding in this moment of crisis, when life has suddenly changed, when we've gone from a moment that going into the park is something which we still have to have a bit of caution about, and where people who are really in need of touch, of human interaction, most are not getting it. They're being cared for wonderfully, but they can't be touched by their medical professions looking after them, and nor can they be touched by their nearest and dearest. And instead, we see the real world appearing tantalizingly, as it's doing indeed for us today, on our screens. And at this moment, I think it's not surprising that people are using art, people are using paintings more than ever as a way of bringing something real into their lives and into their homes. But what I would say is that us in museums, we're really at a crisis moment in dealing with this. The content that we're producing is a reaction to crisis, to change. We need to really be spending time on great strategic thinking on what our future is going to be. Because in the museum sector, like in everything else has changed fundamentally in the last few weeks. And that's really what I wanted to move on to talking about now. Now, the view you see here is a very common view in the pre-COVID world at the National Gallery before 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's of people queuing outside the Sainsbury wing, our main entrance, to come in, queuing incredibly patiently and in long numbers. But that degree of physical proximity is obviously something that we can't think of in the future, and nor is it something that anybody is really going to want. What are the spatial challenges of running a public art museum in a world where people have to stay 2 meters apart from each other? What indeed are also the challenges of running that when you have a museum in the centre of a city that most people have to travel quite a long way to get through using public transport, which nobody is being encouraged to do so at the moment. And then when they get there, the experience of seeing art is often one of seeing it in groups. We know from our visitor research, which we've been looking at more and more over the last few weeks, that many people visit the gallery alone, but they like going around the gallery with others. They don't even mind having to crowd and shuffle from picture to picture, as you can see these visitors doing in our really successful Rembrandt exhibition of a few years ago. But that's a world we're really not going to go back to. And is the world of the exhibition, that fundamental part of the museum economy, is that really going to change? Something else that's really going to have to change is the way in which we think about our financial model. Now, museums in the UK and in the US, and increasingly in continental Europe and elsewhere, have been a sort of mixed economy for the last few years. So many of the great national museums in Britain, for instance, partly receive government funding, partly philanthropic gifts, and partly we raise money ourselves. We raise that through our commercial activities. through a very successful publishing program, through an increasingly successful shop, which has mainly been a physical offer rather than an online one, and also by the catering we offer in the gallery spaces themselves. Now, we will not be able to get revenue from very many of these sources at all, and people will certainly not be able to access them in the same way. So that's a big change to our financial model and a real worry for our financial sustainability. Another issue really to contend with is the question of how we have been renting out and using our spaces. Museums in Britain over the last 10 years, particularly in London, have got an increasing amount of their secure self-generated income from events, from renting out the spaces, from either our gallery spaces, as you see here, for dinners, our seminar spaces, our office spaces for meetings and for seminars and for all sorts of corporate events, and also for corporate sponsorship. Corporate sponsorship in the UK at least, and certainly in the US, is very much based around events, what you can offer in terms of dining, what you can offer in terms of something really special, a fundamental experience that's a real physical experience, and that is going to have to change. Similarly, the experience of visiting the gallery for special events and our whole philanthropic model is something which is really under threat. And that's not just because, for one very good reason, that many of the supporters of museums and galleries everywhere are thinking about where they want to put their money. And it's not surprising at the moment that many people are thinking, actually, I want to put my money into medical science rather than necessarily art. And that's of course their decision, and we expect much more of that in the immediate future. But also, for the reason that many people engage with us and love coming and supporting and giving to the gallery is for parties, for events such as the one I'm showing you on the screen. This is actually not our patrons. This is a group of my colleagues at a party we held in the gallery in November. But these sorts of events are wonderful, and they create a real sense of dynamism and spirit for our patrons. They're also a great way of us raising income as well too. And these, which have been the fundamental platforms of the museum economy, the museum business as it were, are all going to be different in the time ahead. So what do we do? How on earth can we try and monetize? I like using that word, but it's important to do so. The assets that we have, the experiences that we have. One way, of course, is that we can try and provide that digitally. Now, I would like to put a note of caution in here, because I think that's going to be really quite a tricky thing to do. It's been wonderful working on all this exciting content for free at the moment, and that's exactly what you should do in moments of crisis. But how, and is there a market for that to be something that people will pay for in the time ahead? And I've seen some really interesting experiments going on, particularly in the theatre. I'm sharing you a screenshot of my children from behind watching a wonderful online production of The Tempest 2 weeks ago from our living room, but with about 1,000 other people from across the world. And strangely enough, this really seemed like a real experience, even though we were seeing it in our screen. So I think there's huge potential for museums, as for other cultural organisations in that. But I also think that there'll be not a great deal of patience for things that don't really look very good in a couple of months' time. So if we're going to activate this as a mean of bringing income, we're going to have to change our business model, what we get our staff to work on very, very, very quickly. And personally, I think this is going to be a difficult thing to provide a strong financial footing in the time ahead. I'm more interested personally, and this is really a personal view, in the possibilities that digital can offer in terms of exhibition experience. And I'm showing you a slide here of a very exciting experience we worked on at the National Gallery last year. This was an exhibition that was almost completely digital. It was an attempt which was lambasted and criticised in some very, very much in the press for bringing you digitally into a work of art. But I think there is enormous potential in what this can offer, and how you can use this not just to spread knowledge of your great objects in many places, but to find a financial model that might potentially work. And I do think that exhibitions are not gone. I think they are here to stay, but I think the way in which they work will be very different. You won't just do an exhibition because it's nice to have. You'll bring it either because it's going to bring you income, it's going to bring you audience, or because it's exactly what you think you ought to do in engaging people with a type of art object that will mean something to them and they might not previously have experienced. I'm showing you a very strange detail that I love. This is of the oldest English painting in the National Gallery's collection. I say English, but it's probably made by a Frenchman who also understood the art of Siena and the art of Prague. It's a painting called The Wilton Diptych that many of you will know. And in 4 years' time, we're working on a big exhibition of Sienese art and its impact of the Middle Ages with the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And that's a show that's very expensive to put on, but it's something we feel really committed to do. And I think projects like this that we really believe in will be the future of museums, together with ones that we believe in and can also bring us income. Because I think that's the very odd thing about the mixed economy of the museum. It's there for a public purpose, and its purpose is wider for society rather than simply one financial. But of course it has to financially wash its face and break even. And all of us are going to have to make some very difficult choices and decisions in the 9 to 12 months ahead, I think. For all that, I think there are some areas where we can really be sure that we need to concentrate our attention. One, as I've said, is exhibitions. Another is working in the community. And this is an activity which the National Gallery was beginning to do before, like many museums, but we really have to do more of it. Last year, the painting by Artemisia Gentileschi I showed you at the beginning of the talk, the picture that we were going to use for this great exhibition in London, we toured around the United Kingdom to a whole lot of unusual places. It went to a GP's surgery in Pocklington in West Yorkshire. It went to a library in East London. It went to a special women's library in Glasgow. It went to a girls' school in Newcastle. And most complicated of all to arrange, it went to HMP Prison Send, Women Prison Send in Woking in the south of England. So not many people saw the picture on that occasion, but the impact it made on their lives was phenomenal and measurable. And this is the type of activity that I think is going to be really important for the National Gallery in the time ahead, to really be a national institution that's not just working across the 4 nations of Britain and internationally, but is really going out there and changing lives and taking art into people's lives and experiences in unexpected places and unexpected ways. So I wanted to end really today on a note not of depression or of confusion, all emotions which have gone through my mind, and I'm sure many of you in the weeks that we've gone through and in the weeks ahead, but instead a rather very cautious optimism. I think culture, museums, galleries, music, literature is really important because it connects us to a wider humanity. And also it speaks to a world and to an imagination which is beyond the difficult present. It helps us very, very much with our mental health. We've seen that so much in the last 2 months, and it's providing solace and support. It's bringing people out of isolation, and it's bringing people, and in some cases communities, more than ever. And it should be doing that more than ever. So the new world faces museums with many, many challenges, but also a great deal of opportunities, because it's through their role and the things that they hold that they enable us to link our lives to a wider story, which is a national story, a local story, and also a global one. But to do this, museums and the treasures they hold have to work harder than ever to fulfill their public mission. And I want to see a future where children like the children you're seeing on this screen, these are a group of kids from London, from South East London, from West London, who helped us celebrate an acquisition at the National Gallery just before Christmas last year. I want them, rather than them saying thank you, I want them to be thanking us because of the step change that art and culture have made to their lived experiences and the lived experiences of their families, and not because it's a pretty add-on like it was for them coming to the gallery on that morning in December, but because it makes a real practical and measurable difference to their lives. So my personal mission, and this may seem ridiculously idealistic, but I think you have to have ideals and then work out how to do them for the post-COVID-19 world, is for museums and galleries to have a public role and to really, really matter for more people than ever before. And in saying this, I'm shaped by experience, both professional and leadership experience, and also personal. And Anne referred to at the beginning the fact that I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And as an 8-year-old child in 1981, I found great escape through art. I lived that terrible summer, the terrible of the hunger strike, of all sorts of other things, by leafing through a picture book that my granny gave me of pictures of great art of the world. Never thought I'd be able to visit them, but it didn't really matter. I was doing it from my house and into a better place at a moment when nothing else really could. Now, I don't think we all need to go through an experience like the Troubles in Belfast to see the power of art, but I do want art to make a difference to people's lives and to change them for the better. And I think there's no more moment in recent history where that is more important and more meaningful and more worth caring for and shouting for than ever. Thank you very, very much. And I'm really looking forward to the questions and the discussion that we're now going to have.
It's we who thank you. Absolutely brilliant tour de force. Thank you, Caroline. I think we're all inspired and have so much more energy after just this short introduction to this magnificent space. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to just start with a few that are really about sort of basic hygiene questions. I'll call it that so we can kind of move them out of the way. Things like, how would a museum reopen under the conditions? Things like, what could you imagine and your colleagues you're thinking about will be the sanitary conditions? What if we have a vaccine? Is that going to change the conditions? So what are those kind of practical things that you could tell us behind the scenes are being put in place so that people can actually accede again to these magnificent paintings? Did we lose?
Well, safety at the moment is all of our prime concern. I'm here. Hello. So safety is the prime concern of all of us in whatever professional world we're working in. And we're working very hard at the moment to work out how we could give our staff and our visitors a safe experience. It's going to be one where physically many fewer numbers of people are going to be able to come into the museum. We will be enforcing social distancing, which means people have to be 2 meters from each other. I think we're probably going to adopt a system that involves people booking in advance for a ticket, not a ticket that they pay for, but a ticket that gives them a time slot to come in. And that probably, though this is not yet certain, and it may change as we get more advice, probably follow for the meantime a fixed route through the museum. It doesn't mean that they have to go through every space on that route. There'll be ways to dive and duck out of it, and to also to be able to access toilet facilities and other things like that while they're there. We're probably going to be asking everybody to wear masks when they're in the museum as well. I think we won't open until we feel absolutely confident that we can, and also when our government has told us that we can. But we really want to be able to open in some way, and we realise that we'll have to combine opening with digital openings and think in all sorts of ways differently. Do we think about our visitor opening hours in different ways? How do we physically actually work around the building? How do we get the museum ready for visitors to come in, let alone when they're there? These are all questions we're thinking through at the moment. And because no one's done it before, the whole museum community around the world is sharing ideas and thoughts, which is wonderful. It's been a very collaborative moment, actually. We're all shut in our homes, but we're actually all talking even more than ever.
So in fact, that's going to be one of the next things is, sometimes these constraints, they actually create an enormous amount of creativity itself. They allow us to do things we couldn't do otherwise. So over the last 6 weeks, really yourself, what has been your day like? What have you actually been doing? And how do you feel that has actually opened up some new things for you personally?
Gosh, big questions. I think we've all just been finding our lives have become completely different. So like all of you, I'm spending a lot of my life on Zoom calls, on Teams meetings, of spending my whole day on screens. And I don't know about you, but by the end of the day, often I'm completely exhausted. It's much more tiring than being in a one-to-one or a physical environment with people. Judging how meetings go on screens is quite difficult, isn't it? Particularly when you're having to deliver quite difficult messages to people. I would say that apart from the cultural aspect of my job, the purpose of my job, the leadership and management parts, that's been the most challenging thing. I'm sure that's something we've all been finding. But what I have been really loving about it, there are some positive things, if it's not too awful to say, that I really want to take into the world beyond. One is spending more time with my family. One is being able to combine work and home more effectively than before. Another is to enjoy the bird song. This may seem ridiculous, but I never hear birds in the part of London I live in. I never see beautiful skies. That's been utterly amazing. And also having the connections that I and many of us have from all over the world, people reaching out, people getting in touch. We may be shut in, but the world seems bigger in some ways to me than it ever has before.
That's absolutely beautifully said. And I think, it brings home the fact that all of us are facing this at the same time. So somehow we can identify and connect in with that same story. And, when we look back on this, we will look to what were the moments that really stood out, that made us have an aha and kind of live through that. And I think the connections with art that you've described in your presentation even today has brought us that moment. We have some questions, a lot of questions about the financial model, and you've talked about that. Or really, if I could broaden that, the questions are also around, how can that go forward? And you've given us some clues on that. But just describing internally, because I think there's some worry, will you go out of business? And help us understand, you talked about partnerships and other things earlier with me. So help us understand a little bit more that story of the financial and business model.
Well, the business model for museums who have been relying more and more on self-generated income and have been proud to be doing this. This is something that in the UK, we've all been working towards really successfully for the last 20 years. That income is going to be more difficult to generate, but we are not going to go out of business. We are fortunate in that all of the national museums in this country are to a certain extent supported by the taxpayer. We receive grant and aid each year, which is a certain proportion of our annual income and our annual spend, and we use that to make the museum accessible to people by keeping the museum open and by doing programs which bring the collections and the great insights they hold to people. So it's going to be a challenging period. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But we are also confident that we are not going to go under. We have been looking very seriously, and this is all just for this group, but you'll all have been doing this as well, at our finances. We've been looking at what are nice to haves, what we can get rid of. We've made some pretty bold financial decisions pretty quickly. And the decisions that we are going to invest in, those limited areas where we still can, are going to be ones where we can bring income, and also where we can bring content that has the potential of bringing income and also engagement and impact. And we're really thinking about what the role of being a national gallery is at this moment. I mean, I'm from Belfast. The National Gallery is not somewhere that most people in Belfast can visit more than once in their lives. So what can it be doing for people throughout the UK and more widely? Because we know we have a really international audience too. Well, one way is I think that art, or the art of this particular gallery, acts as a connector. So we're a national gallery of international art. We tell those intersected and interrelated stories. Another is by partnering really well with other institutions throughout the UK. There are some small museums which are brilliant museums, fantastic places with great programs that are going to find it difficult. We can learn a lot from what they do, and we have been, but also we can work together so that we can work more effectively for people all over the country, and we can provide, perhaps, I don't know, some form of services which enable them to become more sustainable, such as, for instance, we have incredible international expertise in the conservation of paintings, the scientific study of paintings, environmental conditions. Those are not things that are found in many small museums, but we can work more with them so that they have that benefit, and then they can perhaps save costs in other areas.
So that it was brilliant, because you just said exactly what I think all of us can take away, in that, you know, what is the role of the National Gallery? We could ask this of ourselves. What's our role? what are our companies and as organizations' roles? And, you know, what can we do more for people? And as you're reflecting on that, I think it obviously begs the question, what can we do as leaders to support you, obviously, in your institution, but the cultural organizations, the institutions that obviously in a time of health concern, and we've seen that research from philanthropy, you know, health is really at the top of the list now, and maybe arts and cultural institutions are rightly at a lower priority at this time. But I think there's still things that we can be doing as we're looking at our own purpose and future. What kinds of recommendations do you have, or thoughts? Because we won't be hosting, as you've said, those big events inside the spaces in the near term.
Gosh, that's a great question, Anne. And I think the benefits, the great joy of IWF is that we can all learn from each other. I think that it's inevitable, and in fact it's right, that art and culture should be lower down the philanthropy list than medical care at the moment. But I would say that art and culture can play an incredibly significant and powerful role in our mental well-being and our mental health. One of the greatest problems of the COVID epidemic, apart from the illness itself, is the loneliness and the isolation. And the National Gallery and other museums have been finding that the activities that we've been doing in terms of getting people to make art themselves is really helping with people's mental journey through this moment. So I'd encourage people working in the business community to think about ways in which you might partner with museums, galleries, cultural organizations more widely to think of this question, how we together collectively can improve people's mental health and well-being. I mean, it's been a big issue in the last couple of years, but it's going to be a fundamental issue to the way we move forward. And I've been really excited in seeing how all sorts of places have done amazing things. There's a great arts institution, which I'm going to plug shamelessly, called First Sight in Colchester in Essex, which has been producing these wonderful art packs for you to do at home with a whole series of internationally recognized artists. Jeremy Deller, Grayson Perry, Tracy Emin. Really go to their site and download it for yourself. It's amazing. So these are the sorts of ways in which we can work, and also by spreading this these ideas through our various networks, because, you know, our worlds, personal and professional, are all about sharing. They're all about bringing together, and they're all about seeing from the different things we all have to offer do go to make a better, more effective world.
It's absolutely true, and you're showing us just the way that the research and that someone like you can bring meaning and help us. Then we reflect. We're pulled out of our current context and brought into new spaces, and that really is important for our own creativity and our own ability to relax and solve problems that are facing us. We have questions now that are actually talking about that in terms of the impact of art history, historical research, and even these kinds of I'll call them MOOCs, but they're much more than that, because the institutions like yours have been organizing art history and creating it more in the sort of chronological or topical sense. Do you see that shifting? Will it become more about helping to maybe accompany us in different kinds of journeys, and not necessarily the classic art history coursework? And how is that going in terms of just, there is a question here also about that, students of art history, and what's happened to them. So there's
Great
two parts.
question. Great question. It's a bit of both. I'll take the first part to begin with. I think that you don't need to do one or the other. In fact, the research can enable you to tell deeper, richer, more personal, and more effective stories. So, for instance, I'm really, really interested as an academic researcher, not that I get much time for that these days, in 16th century Venice. Now, that was a time when plague was constantly affecting people. Titian, this great artist who I adore, he died during an outbreak of plague. People have lived through very difficult times in the past, and they have still found ways of really enabling their creativity and enabling the world to continue. And that gives me enormous hope at the moment. That's one of the things I've really held on to in the last 8 weeks. And that's a role I think that historic art of any type can, or music or literature can do in enabling us to find a way through this. So you don't need to separate the art history from the personal messages. I think it's stronger actually if it comes together, and it really gives you it gives you an in-depth insight into the past, and we're shaped by our past very, very much. They shouldn't shape us completely, but there's a lot we can learn from that. So that's one thing. Now, the question of art history, I'm really involved in Britain in trying to get more diverse people to study art history. I'm involved with a charity called Art History Link Up, which I teach for a bit, which gives state school students opportunities to do art history at A level, which in the UK is not something anyone really gets unless they go to a private school or a very few privileged state schools. I'm also on the board of the Association for Art History, which, as it said, is not for art historians, it's for art history. And it's trying to make art history something which is not for the elite, but which is for a larger audience. And for goodness sake, it's really strange we even ask this question. We're all visual. We use images more than ever. Anyone can read a painting. They don't need a lot of background to do it. So it's about empowering people to be able to have that visual literacy. And the impact that it has on children, on young people, on people of any age, I think is absolutely remarkable. So art history is there are many places where art history is still studied. It's being, art history degree courses are going on for those art historians who come out and want to work as art historians in the future. I think they're going to have to think much more about engagement. I don't think it's enough just to do the research. You have to do the research, but you have to be thinking all the time on how you're going to present this to people. What does this mean in our world, in our society? There's no room for an ivory tower, but there is room for brilliant research.
I think that's what you just bring. You've just demonstrated that by showing us exactly how exciting it can be. And when you create meaning, people want to go further and deeper and bring it into their lives in a more intense way. If I could just use the last couple of minutes, because there are some questions. I think we've had a great tour de force from value propositions and how you use your assets to reconfigure them and put them into new kinds of products and services that you quickly test and push out there. We've even seen, there were a couple of questions that people buy all of their Christmas gifts and other things in the museum shop, and I'm sure you'd have plenty to say about that. But let's turn back a little bit to the art at the close, because there are people who still want to know things like your favorite painting that you think we should download now. And you did show us at least one that's in the British memory as the most important painting. But what else should we be going back to now that we're so excited and we've got the National Gallery in our browser windows? And what should we click on next to be excited for the rest of the evening and tell others about what we've experienced today?
For the rest of the evening, gosh, if I could choose, very difficult to choose a single painting, but one that might be really lovely for this audience as we move into the evening and into the moment of relaxation is a picture I always come back to, a picture by the French Impressionist, well, he wouldn't have called him that, the French 19th century painter Degas. It's a painting of a woman having her hair combed. It's a matte painting. My colleague Chris Riopel just calls it the Big Red because that's what it really is. But I think it's about that cusp of something that is very, very intimate being shared with other people, and how something which is very, very pleasurable, having your hair combed, looking beautiful, can also be very, very painful if someone just tugs. So it brings me back to this idea of trust. We've got to, at the moment, some people feel they can't really trust people, but we've all got to trust everybody, because if we don't trust people, we're not going to get through this together. And so bizarrely, I would say, go and look at Degas' Combing Your Hair and think not just about your hair being combed, but I think about trust and how that's expressed in human relationships and also professional relationships.
That's a very good point. I can't then close with just a few more minutes without asking you personally the impact that this has. Do you mind if we get a little bit intimate on your own sort of personal experience of being a leader at this moment, leading maybe your family, leading the museum, having to actually be stronger during a time that is for many people a moment when we feel very weak? How have you actually risen to this occasion? We can see you have enormous energy and passion for what you do, but are there any little things that you would share with us about this last few weeks and what you're about to prepare for going forward?
So I know we've all been thinking about this. I've been trying to have some time to myself every day, to do something that is not work or listening to the news or doing homework with my children, which is driving me insane, but doing something creative. So I used to play the cello at school. I've started playing that again incredibly badly. That's giving me real pleasure. I also have started drawing regularly in a sketchbook. I do draw quite a lot as a way of remembering things, but again, I'm very bad at it. So I've been trying to channel my mental energy into doing something creative where you produce something at the end of a period. And I'm finding that very relaxing, very therapeutic. And in terms of some of the very difficult things that I'm going through at work at the moment, and I know are true of you all, again, I think, how would I like to hear a sort of message? I mean, I may not like what I've been told, but I want to believe that the person giving it to me is talking with integrity, is talking to another human being, and is talking with empathy, even if the news is bad and difficult. And to think of that, and to think of the people who work with us as people.
Coming from Belfast as a child, you still have the child that lives inside. It's a beautiful thought. And as we've seen so many children who've been with their parents locked at home, appropriating, observing these pieces of art, imitating them, taking pictures and juxtaposing it, you wonder what's going to happen with that moment for them when they become adults and they look back on that time when they were locked at home and it was a piece of art that they suddenly created with mommy, or daddy and the family. And that really speaks a lot to why we wanted you today to share your story, bring us into this intimate view of the National Gallery. And I know it will be for many people not the last time that we click and make a favorite out of the National Gallery end of view. So thank you very much for this very tour de force, as I said, very exciting. And I think with that, we will close our today's session. I want to thank the International Women's Forum UK, a wide variety of members around the team, technical, Katja and Mary, that were working on this, and most of all you, Dr. Caroline Campbell of the National Gallery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you all so much for being with me today. And I look forward to welcoming you to the National Gallery, digitally or physically, and in fact, probably a bit of both in the times ahead. Thank you so much for letting me be with you today.
And if you want to pass this recording on to your friends, which I highly recommend, you will see that it's in the chat, and you'll also, because you signed up, be able to get a copy of the information. So thank you. Bye-bye from now.